What the hell was that?
We are talking ARACHNIA. This is a 2003 movie directed and written by Brett Piper and stars Rob Monkiewicz. And let's say 2003 movie, so this came out a year after the kind of somewhat medium budget movie Eight-Legged Freaks. And that's kind of normal with these sort of things. When a kind of a higher budget movie comes out, we get a slew of mockbuster imitation style movies. This obviously is one of them, but we've had a trickle of kind of giant spider movies ever since. Now, this movie actually weirdly reminds me of the first two Evil Dead films, and I'll explain why that is in just a minute. So what is the story, first of all? So it focuses on a crew of a light aircraft. We learn that there is a group of students that are flying to an archaeological dig. 4 students, a kind of professor and the pilot. And they are forced to crash land after a meteor shower. And these meteors have disturbed a kind of underground nest of giant arachnids that have kind of come up seeking kind of human flesh. Our group of protagonists meet an old farmer who may have discovered them beforehand. And these kind of creatures develop a taste for human flesh. What'll happen? You'll have to watch the movie to find out. So, this definitely falls under the B-movie category. There is very much a low-budget schlockiness to this movie, which will put some people off, but some people will enjoy it for that. Very much a kind of a, somewhat of a 50s style monster movie. But it does remind me of Evil Dead, as I've mentioned, in a couple of ways. The actual... The parallels here, for example, is we have a group of protagonists holed up in an old farmhouse shack, defending themselves from creatures outside. We have a square-jawed hero who wields a chainsaw, and we have our creatures kind of stop motion style, a bit like the original Evil Dead used a couple of times. So because of watching this, it was kind of reminding me of a giant spider version of Evil Dead in many ways, but certainly not as iconic or memorable. But what we can say, like I said, I do feel there's a certain charm to this movie because it is kind of so schlocky. The characters here are very kind of over the top and broad stereotypes, but as such, are quite memorable and distinct from each other. And have a quite fun. I have to say as well, we have our female lead is probably the character which is taken the most seriously, and there is a bit commentary about how she's undervalued because she's a woman in a man's world, etc., etc. So a little bit of social commentary for a low budget 2003 movie. We actually do see quite a lot of our monsters are these giant sort of spider-like creatures, and one of the things I enjoyed about this, it actually does try and comment on the fact that these kind of creatures shouldn't exist because of their weight and stuff like this. The professor says, well, they can't be giant spiders because they wouldn't be able to support themselves and things like this. So it does address obviously scientific issues maybe with that have been raised about kind of things like giant spiders, and obviously it addresses them, but there's no explanation given. But I like the fact that it was at least addressed there. The movie's actually quite well paced in regards to, ultimately it's a kind of a siege film at the end of the day, where we have our group of survivors here having to defend themselves against gradually kind of growing numbers of spiders, and of course then they decide to try and take the fight to them, which I thought was quite good. Inevitably you have the queen kind of spider as well, along with some kind of gross kind of little maggoty type things that are obviously the kind of the larvae and stuff like that. The effects, they're kind of stop motion, and they're very comparable to, like I said, the stop motion effects that you would have seen in Evil Dead. Now, Evil Dead was in the early 80s, this is 2003, so it's kind of 20 years later, and you don't really feel like the effects work is really any better than those kind of, scenes from the Evil Dead, but they still have a kind of a certain charm. But Ray Harryhausen, this is not. But I still kind of quite like the kind of the fun stop motion effects, and they do use some practical effects here. Now, the early 2000s, we started to see the kind of the proliferation of sort of CGI, and obviously those have really kind of aged quite badly. So I appreciate the fact that at least here the effects work is for the most part practical, be it either puppets or kind of stop motion for the most part, which I thought was kind of quite fun. But what doesn't work with this movie is full of inconsistencies and kind of like errors and mistakes. You know, you'll see kind of sequences in the film where, you know, we have a couple of different camera angles obviously showing the kind of the same scene, and like people's position will significantly change, you know, in between kind of scenes and kind of stuff like that. The acting is super kind of cheesy and kind of stereotyped sort of characters, massively kind of over the top. The only kind of character I would say is somewhat grounded, as I say, is a kind of female lead, and maybe to the degree the pilot, but he doesn't really have much in the way of being a character as such, I would say. He's just a broad, heroic kind of stereotype who's kind of selfless and stuff, but doesn't really have much on him outside of that, to be fair. The effects certainly won't be for everyone because they are very kind of cheap looking. It's a low budget film in 2003. I still quite enjoyed them, but I'm kind of used to watching a kind of level of film where the effects are never going to be quite as high. But there's some silly kind of plot elements here, for example, that the filmmakers just seem to have said one thing and then done the next. For example, we're told that the nearest town is 60 miles away. 60 miles! And yet we see the spiders, which have come out of a specific hole, attack a town. And, you know, which is, we just told was 60 miles away. But they're just coming out and dealing with them then and there with this kind of like little farmhouse. Doesn't really make sense because we've just established the town is too far away. So, you know, they just want to have a bit of a big body count and lapses in logic like that. But that's kind of stuff like that is kind of peppered throughout the film. And then we kind of get to our finale, which I have to say is a real mess. We get kind of army characters come in. It's silly, cheesy, and then it kind of goes into this, which is, it looks like a bunch of people, friends, just fannying about. You could enjoy the film, not ironically, I think, but, you know, knowing that it's going to be a cheesy B movie, low budget, you can still enjoy this film legitimately, I think, until we kind of get to that very kind of end scene when it just becomes a parody. And I think it was cheesy, it was silly, there was inconsistencies, there were plot holes, but it was not a parody at that point. But the last kind of like 10, 15 minutes or so is just ultimately mega silly. It has a certain charm. I don't think it's necessarily an awful film. It's watchable, but there's a lot kind of wrong with it in regards to any type of finesse or kind of like real kind of good work in regards to sort of storytelling. It's a basic plot, not a lot really kind of to it, with kind of stereotyped characters and very kind of a low budget, but it still has an element of fun. I will give this a 4 out of 10. Not quite a terrible movie, but obviously certainly below average. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.